I still don't know what was standing at the foot of my bed that night. It wasn't my mom. It wasn't anyone alive. And the terrifying part is, I think it was trying to warn me. My name is Megan. I'm 35 years old now, and I grew up in Kentucky. When I was 5, my parents bought a funeral home. Not worked at one bought it. It was over 100 years old at the time, and they ran the business themselves. We lived in the apartment upstairs, right above the viewing rooms, the chapel, and the embalming area. Even now, decades later, my parents still own it. I still visit sometimes. But every time I walk through those doors, that heavy silence feels the same. It's not the kind of quiet that comes from peace. It's the kind that listens back. Growing up there was strange, but for me, it became normal. The smell of flowers, formaldehyde, and old wood mixed together every morning. I did homework in the same rooms where people came to mourn their loved ones. Sometimes I'd de-ride my tricycle down the long carpeted hallway that connected the chapel to the viewing rooms. My parents were busy most of the time, so I had the run of the place. But even when I was little, I knew we weren't really alone in that building. You know how kids sometimes talk to imaginary friends? Mine wasn't imaginary. I remember it clearly. I was 6 years old, sitting on one of the couches in a viewing room, swinging my legs. It was quiet, too quiet. That's when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I looked toward the corner of the room, and a woman was standing there. She was pale, maybe in her 20s, wearing a long black dress. Her red hair stood out against the dim light of the room. She smiled softly and waved. "Hello, little girl," she said. I froze for a second, but she seemed kind, so I waved back. Then, right in front of me, she just vanished into thin air. That was the first time I met Alice. Alice became ... familiar. Over time, I started seeing her almost every day. Sometimes in the corners, sometimes just standing in the middle of a room like she belonged there. She always smiled, always said hello. When I came home from school, she'd be waiting by the door. "Hello, Megan. How was your day?" She'd listen quietly as I talked, then slowly disappear before I could ask her anything back. It didn't feel scary at first. Honestly, she felt like a friend, maybe even like a second mother. But that changed when I realized what she was protecting me from. The embalming room was always off limits. My parents said it was dangerous and that I shouldn't go near it. But one day, curiosity got the better of me. The air was colder there, like stepping into a freezer. I remember the sharp smell of chemicals and metal. There was a table in the center, covered with a white sheet. Then I heard a low growl. At first, I thought maybe a raccoon had gotten in, but when I looked toward the corner, I saw something that didn't make sense. It looked like a girl about my age. But her skin wasn't right. It was gray and shiny like scales. Her eyes were red, and when she opened her mouth, her tongue split at the end like a snake's. She just stood there, staring at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then, suddenly, Alice appeared between us. The creature tilted its head, studying her. Alice's face changed. It wasn't gentle anymore. She raised her arm, and the creature began to choke. It lifted off the ground, gasping, scratching at its throat. Then Alice flicked her wrist, and the thing slammed into the wall and vanished. She knelt in front of me, her face calm again. "Be more careful," she whispered before fading away. After that, I never went into the embalming room again. Even as I grew older, Alice stayed around. Sometimes she'd warn me about things. Once, in high school, I snuck out to go to a party. That night, my mom told me she woke up to see Alice standing in her bedroom. She said, "Megan's not in her room." When I got home, my mom was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for me. I don't know if I was more scared of my mom or Alice that night, but Alice wasn't the only spirit in the house. There were others, many others. We used to see an old man in a gray suit standing near the chapel's organ. We called him the Gray Man. He never spoke, never moved much, just stood by the organ, watching. Sometimes if we walked in, he'd nod politely. It was like he was guarding the place. But once my dad had to move the organ for repairs. That night, we heard banging coming from the chapel. When my dad went down to check, the organ bench had been flipped over and all the candles were lit. We moved the organ back the next morning. The noises stopped. There was also a little girl spirit. She had long blonde hair and wore a pink dress. She liked to play games hide and seek, mostly. We'd hear laughter echo down the hallway, then see her peek out from behind furniture before vanishing. She wasn't scary, just lonely, but not all of them were harmless. In one of the viewing rooms, we sometimes saw a man wearing what looked like a Civil War uniform. We called him the General. He never spoke, but he always tipped his hat when he appeared. I thought he was just another resident, but one night he saved my dad. My dad was working late, alone downstairs, when the old light fixtures came loose from the ceiling. He said he felt a firm hand on his shoulder pull him back just seconds before it fell. When he turned around, no one was there, except the General standing across the room. He tipped his hat, then faded away. The worst night came years later when I was 17. My parents were out of town for a conference and I was alone in the house. I'd gotten used to the occasional noises, shadows, or whispers, but that night was different. It started around midnight. I was in bed, scrolling on my phone when I heard footsteps downstairs. Slow, heavy ones. At first, I thought it might just be the building settling, but then came a door slam. Then another. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the hall. Every step I took, the floorboards creaked louder. The sound was coming from the embalming room. I didn't want to go near it, but I had to make sure no one had broken in. When I reached the door, the air was freezing cold again. The doorknob was icy to the touch. I opened it, and the room was pitch black, except for the faint outline of someone standing near the table. It wasn't Alice. It was the reptilian thing. But this time, it was crawling on the ceiling, staring down at me. Its mouth stretched open wider than a human jaw could. I screamed and dropped the flashlight. When the beam rolled across the floor, I saw something else, Alice, standing between me and it again. She shouted something I couldn't understand, and the creature screeched before vanishing into the wall. Then Alice turned to me. Her face looked sad this time. She whispered, "It's not gone. Just sleeping." Then she disappeared too. My parents came home the next morning and found me asleep on the couch, still holding the flashlight. I told them what happened. My dad just nodded and said, "You're not the first to see it." I moved out a couple years later. I still visit sometimes, but every time I do, I see Alice watching from the end of the hallway. She still smiles, still waves. But every once in a while, when I pass by the embalming room, I swear I can hear that low growl again, coming from inside. And sometimes I wonder, if Alice isn't human, what exactly is she protecting us from? I still don't know what I saw that night. Even now, years later, I can still remember those eyes pure white, lifeless, but staring right at me. I've worked around death for years, but nothing has ever haunted me like that night at the funeral home. I used to work at a small family-owned funeral home in the Midwest. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My job was mostly preparing bodies for viewing, doing makeup, dressing them, and sometimes helping set up the wake. It's a quiet job, unsettling to some people, but to me, it became routine. The smell of disinfectant, the low hum of the fluorescent lights, the cold steel tables, those things didn't bother me anymore. My coworker, Frank, had been in the business for over 20 years. He was the type of guy who'd seen everything and didn't scare easily. But I remember something you told me on my first week there. He said, "Working around death this much, you're bound to be close to souls that haven't moved on yet. Don't be surprised if you feel things you can't explain." I laughed it off back then. I wish I hadn't. A few months later, we received a body late one evening. I was helping unload it from the transport van when I froze. The name tag read, Ethan Cole. I knew him. We weren't best friends or anything, but we'd gone to high school together. He was one of those guys who always seemed full of life, athletic, healthy, the kind of person you'd never expect to see on a table in a morgue. The report said he died suddenly of a heart attack. He wasn't even 30. That hit me harder than I expected. Frank noticed the look on my face and asked if I was okay. I told him I knew the guy, and Frank nodded slowly, like he understood. As we prepped the body, I couldn't stop staring at Ethan's face. Even in death, he looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Frank mentioned that Ethan had a twin brother who had been handling all the arrangements but had been acting strange since the death. He hasn't left his house in days, Frank said. Barely talks. Looks like he hasn't slept. For some reason, that detail stuck with me. Twins have a weird connection. I've always heard stories about one feeling the other's pain, that kind of thing. But something about this felt different, off. A few hours before the wake, as we were setting up the viewing area, this old woman came by. She said she was a family friend, but she didn't come in. She just stood near the door, eyes darting around nervously. Then she said something that made the hair on my neck stand up. Be careful tonight, she told me quietly. Evil walks when grief opens the door. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and walked away into the rain. I stood there for a second, confused. When I told Frank about it, he just chuckled and said, People say weird stuff when death's involved. Don't let it get to you. But it did get to me. It was like she knew something I didn't. That night, the wake began. The lights were dimmed. Candles flickered softly, and a faint smell of lilac filled the air. The room was quiet except for the occasional muffled sob. I was mostly in the back, making sure everything ran smoothly. That's when I saw him, Ethan's twin brother, Evan. I almost mistook him for Ethan. The resemblance was unreal. But something about Evan's presence felt wrong. He was pale, distant. His eyes didn't seem to focus on anyone or anything. When people tried to speak to him, he just nodded blankly. He didn't cry. He didn't even blink much. After a while, he excused himself and walked down the hallway toward the back rooms. Something in me, curiosity, maybe unease, made me follow. The hallway was quiet, lit only by a single flickering bulb. I followed him until I heard murmuring coming from one of the prep rooms, the one where we dekept Ethan's body earlier. At first, I thought he was talking on the phone. But then I realized he was praying, or at least it sounded like praying. The words didn't make sense, some strange, rhythmic chanting that didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. I peeked around the corner. Evan was standing beside the table, his hands trembling, whispering faster and faster. And then he stopped. That's when I saw his eyes. They were completely white, no pupils, no color, just empty. My heart dropped into my stomach. I froze, not sure what I was looking at. He turned his head toward me, slow and mechanical. And in this low, broken voice he said, I have to give his soul away, or it'll take me instead. Before I could react, the lights flickered. For a split second, everything went black. When they came back on, he was gone. The room was empty, except for Ethan's body lying on the table. But something about it was different now. His mouth was slightly open. His hands, which I knew I had folded earlier, were now clenched tight. I ran out of that room and didn't stop until I was outside. Frank found me standing in the parking lot, shaking. I told him what I'd seen, but he didn't believe me. He said Evan had probably just left, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. A few days later, I heard from the police. Evan had gone missing. They said he'd left his house the night of the wake and never returned. His car was found parked on a bridge 2 towns over, door open, keys still inside, but no sign of him. The investigation went on for weeks, but nothing came of it. No body, no clues, just gone. Frank told me to let it go, that death does weird things to people's minds, but deep down I couldn't. There was something unnatural about that night. A few weeks later, I went back to the prep room where it all happened. Everything looked normal again. But as I stood there, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. In the corner of the room, near the table where Ethan had lain, was a small piece of torn paper. It looked old, brittle. On it, written in shaky handwriting, were 3 words, "He took me." I don't know what really happened that night. I don't know what that old woman meant, or what kind of evil she was talking about. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the prep room late at night, I still feel like someone's standing just behind me. Once, I thought I saw a figure reflected in the stainless steel table, a face that looked exactly like Ethan's. Only this time, the eyes were white. Maybe Frank was right? Maybe working around death means being close to things we're not meant to understand. But I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty. That night at the funeral home, something crossed over, and I don't think it ever left. I woke up to a quiet room, the dim hospital light casting shadows across the ceiling. I still don't know why I felt it, but in that moment, with my baby daughter lying beside me, I recognized death as something alive. I'd spent nights in the hospital before, always co-watching over her. The room was cold, sterile white sheets, machines humming softly, the faint smell of antiseptic and has-to-be-changed gowns. She'd been born with a congenital brain condition. Doctors told us it would end at home someday. But this night, we were still at the hospital because she'd grown weaker, and we weren't ready. She lay in her crib, hooking up to her feeding tube, a small stethoscope we kept close, checking placement, checking heartbeat. The fluorescent light above flickered once, then again, and outside the window, the world was dark and still. I had the chair pulled up next to her bed. I sat there, watching her sleep, counting breaths in my head. It was just before midnight. Then something felt off. For a moment, I thought I heard her gasp, but dismissed it, thinking it was me, my anxiety leaking into reality. Her little chest rose and fell slowly, but then it stopped. The stethoscope showed no heartbeat. I placed my hand on her skin. Cold. She was blue-tinged. Breathing gone. The monitor was silent. I panicked. For 5 minutes, or what felt like hours, I sat there, frozen. The empty room seemed to close in. I could hear the distant beeping of other machines, a nurse's conversation muffled in the hallway, the soft hum of the air conditioner. Outside, night pressed thick against the window. And then, a single gasp. Her tiny body convulsed gently. I thought it was gas, just a fragment of a breath. Then again, another gasp. Then a rhythm agonizingly slow, but real. Her mouth opened, eyes still closed, chest heaving. It wasn't recovery, exactly, it was a reflex. A last-ditch survival wave from some deep part of her brainstem. I held her. I felt her lips move. I listened to the stethoscope. Normal heart rate, present. Color returned to her cheeks. The beep returned. I sat back, stunned. I cried relieved, scared, thankful. I couldn't believe what I'd seen. She'd come back. It wasn't over. The nurse arrived a few minutes later. Calm. Professional. She looked at the monitor, looked at our daughter. Then she told me something I wish someone had warned me about. Dying infants often practice death, she said. They die and revive several times. I didn't believe it, and yet there it was. After that revival, we watched her for hours. She looked fragile, vulnerable, but alive. Then again, she stopped. Gone. No heartbeat. No breath. Blue. Cold. For what felt like eternity. Then, once more, the gasp. The same reflex, the same gasp. She pulled herself back again. 2 times now. 2 false endings. The process stretched for 8 long hours. I sat there in the cold room, hours drifting by. Light outside turned from dark to the first pale gray of dawn. I watched her monitor like a hawk. I held her hand when she gasped. I whispered, "I'm right here," more times than I can count. I wondered what part of her was still fighting and what part had already let go. And then finally she stopped. It was morning. The hallway lights glowed faintly. I watched the chest rise one last time. I watched the heartbeat slow. I watched the color fade. I held her tiny hand and told her she was loved. The monitor flatlined. I kissed her forehead. She went. In the aftermath, I keep thinking about what I saw. I had never seen death up close like that. Not as a final moment of quiet passing, but as a tug of war, something on the edge of life reaching toward the living. I still don't understand how she could revive herself that way. How one tiny person could tip over and then come back. I understand now why stories of the undead exist. Zombies, ghosts, second chances at dying. I saw it, and I still don't believe it. But here's what haunts me. When I closed her eyes, when I finally let go, her breathing didn't just vanish. It ended. Yet for hours there was this limbo. I held her in limbo. I watched the room shift from night into dawn. I watched shadows stretch. I smelled antiseptic and watched monitors beep. I heard distant voices filtered through corridor walls. And now, every once in a while, I wonder if she's still somewhere in that pause. If the part of her that gasped twice is still suspended somewhere between the living and what comes next. I walk past empty rooms now, feel that chill at my back. And I remember the gasps. I remember the return to pinkness. I remember the slow fade. I guess what I'm saying is, death isn't always a door that closes quietly. Sometimes it opens and closes, opens again, just so you can see it. I still don't know what I saw, but I know it happened. And I know I'll never forget it.